Well, thank you guys and welcome back. I really enjoyed every one of your presentations, and if I could just take a minute to broadly summarize some of the key points that came out of what was presented today. So Ken Yang presented us with a kind of a manual of constructed ecosystems, how we integrate ecosystems into the fabric of architecture and urbanism. And Michael, I really like the fact that you presented a kind of a multi-scalar perspective on biological inspired materials and forms. What you think are the value propositions and benefits that emerge from a biocentric approach to design. Martha, immense challenges in the material economy, how it is by virtue of its size, fundamentally at odds with ecological systems at the planetary scale, and how this then ties back to choices that we make in the construction sector. My own presentation was a bit like Michael's. We talked about regenerative design. I talked about it in the context of Asia, and that this was an underlying force in the projects that I showed, that it was an active integration of the ecological and the human in the interest of creating new capitals, human, social, and financial capital. So let's kick around a few ideas following what we talked about. And I'm going to start with Neil, only because you didn't have a presentation. So Neil, what does Ramboll make of all of this? You are in the business of delivering solutions. And you have a footprint, meaning you are in places as diverse as India and Denmark, developing and developed worlds. How would your project teams incorporate ideas on regenerative design or take on board questions of material readiness as part of what they do? What are the low-hanging fruits here?
I think, the low-hanging fruits here is actually are here that everybody is actually on board on this journey. If you look at a company like Ramboll, who has worked with sustainability, traditional sustainability in many, many years, and also in our new strategy has that as a center. I think that the low-hanging fruit is actually that all people more or less are on board and that they want really to do good. And in this context, I think we have used also the Bill Reed and consorts explanation about doing less harm, do more good. And I think that has really taken off. Everybody understands what it is. They understand it's not only a net zero journey. What they also understand is that there are things we won't do. There is a red line on the left-hand side. There is a red line to both on projects we won't do, but also in, for instance, in the building sector, the materials and things that we don't want to do. And in particular, I would actually like to highlight our buildings people who are normally seen as the most conservative, I would say, as a construction sector is normally seen as the most conservative. But I think both our architects and building designers are super much on, and they're actually leading the regenerative design journey in Ramboll, I would say.
If I could just extend that question to Martha. What are the low-hanging fruits of what you talked about, the novel entities? I mean, one of the takeaways I had was paint, for example. That's a clear choice. But you know, if you had to pick three things that you absolutely have to think about that are no-brainers, what would they be?
Well, we have to be very cautious about the material selection in terms of embodied carbon. So reduce concrete usage and reduce steel usage and increase bio-based materials. I don't know if you want to count that as one, but if we take that as one, then number two would be up your education so that you can lower your hazardous substance consumption in building projects. And number three would be to realign our vision so that we use other drivers and not just aesthetics as architects to land our design.
Speaking on behalf of architects, I have to say, I think aesthetics gets a bad rep. I think we are preoccupied with the idea of delight. You know, and design is discussed in terms of commodity, firmness, and delight, and that they are three equal interconnected aspects of what we do. Michael, I want to talk to you about regeneration, because when I was when I was writing my book, Ecopuncture, about regeneration, it hit me that it wasn't just about what we do at the drawing board, about the choices we make, about, you know, the aesthetic aspects of a project or the functionality of it, but it's an ecosystem within which we operate. So what is the value chain here of getting regenerative design done? Who takes the lead, do you think?
Yeah, okay, so that's quite a sort of multifaceted question. I'll do my best to answer it. Who takes the lead? Well, I think it's important that teams are led by people that are actually good at integrative thinking. And you know, architects can be good at that. They can be terrible. And in our book Flourish, which I co-wrote with Sarah Ichioka, we put forward an alternative to the slightly old-fashioned idea of the sort of architect as egotistical superhero. And in that sort of old, perhaps slightly simplistic, but still with a grain of truth to it, in that old model, you would sometimes get an iconic architect who would do a sexy sketch on the back of an envelope and then expect the rest of the team to just make it happen. And a much more inclusive and inspiring model, I think, is the idea of the architect as conductor. So Benjamin Zander, in his TED talk, he talks about how a conductor doesn't make a sound, but relies instead for their power on making other people powerful and unifying that into a cohesive result. And so that's the role that I think a design team leader should aspire to try and draw the best out of the team. And Nirmal, were you also asking about the sort of cost and value side of things, or were you going to come back to that?
Yeah, we can start on that as well, if you like. How do we frame the question of cost, and who benefits from this and who pays for it?
Yes, so I actually think it's important that we challenge existing maladaptive approaches. And when I say challenge, I mean as deliberately as possible without anger or aggression. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to, if someone says, well, what's the cost or value proposition for this? I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, can you tell me what the cost benefit analysis is for causing large parts of the tropics to be uninhabitable and large numbers of developing societies to collapse? And these aren't comfortable questions, and the answers aren't necessarily straightforward. But one way or another, we do need to develop solutions that deliver long-term value. And I've often been able to lead teams that produce results that are much cheaper in the long term. They just cost slightly more up front. And we may need to adjust our economic perspectives to accommodate that.
So much, I mean, that's a fair comment, but so much of what happens across the world is speculative, isn't it? I mean, you know, somebody builds and somebody else operates. Neil, you wanted to say something, please?
Yeah, can I just say that I think also it depends on where you are in the world. I think that at least the more professional developers, and I'm not talking small housing or anything like that, but you could say developers of large buildings, office buildings and blocks and whatever, they can see that more, you could say, traditional, sustainable, low carbon housing, even with the greenery and all this stuff, is actually easier to rent out, and people are there for a longer time. They also want to pay more. So I think it's, of course, depending on what part of society you are in. And I would say that in the Nordics, we have actually shifted from having a very local building market to now have an international building market. And what we saw with the international developers coming in was that they had a complete different view on the quality of the buildings, because they see maybe a complete different business case than the little local developer here in this little small country. So I think I'm not so afraid of the cost. I'm more afraid of the kind of chopped up value chain that we have. How can we influence in the value chain? How can we make sure that the material producers are actually producing materials that we will use, that they also have a business case? And to be honest, I can't really overlook how all these different business cases in the different part of the value chain are adding up to one business case. So that's what I think, that it's necessary that we actually connect the value chain so
Martha,
that we can get the materials that we want to have. I don't know, Martha.
Yeah, would you like to comment on that?
It's such a valid question about cost, and I think that Michael has a fantastic point where what is the cost when broaden the definition of what the true cost is. Extraordinarily valuable approach to thinking about what we're actually doing. The other aspect of cost is that there's always this assumption that if you are investing in better materials that they will cost more. But one of the key factors of cost is if you simply build less or less square meters and you build smaller, it's a very direct way of reducing costs. So I'd like to put that out on the table as well. I know in Denmark, we're very focused on, for example, our embodied carbon impacts per square meter, because that's how it's coming into the new building regulations. However, it's not just a question about reducing per square meter. We also need to be reducing the square meters that we're building.
I'll be the span on the works here because I operate in a highly speculative environment where developers tend to take a very short-term view of costs, and that's largely because there are so many speculative developments around me. And the argument that the green building movement has made in the last 15-20 years is that there's great payback to this, right? So if you go green or you do the right things, there is some kind of an incentive to the developer or the occupants that translates into a benefit. Now, that may be true for some things, but there are other things that in the context of regenerative design, for example, that we're talking about bringing ecosystems back into the city, about what Ken Young was talking about. How do we quantify the cost of that? It's very difficult to do that, in part because the party that pays is not the party that benefits. It is a bigger benefit. So when Michael, you say that, well, we're talking about planetary cost, right? The developer in Vietnam is going to argue back with you and say, I'm sorry, I'm here to make money in the next 5 years. How do you frame cost and value in these environments? Anyone?
I think it's very difficult because the difficulty comes into that you could say the ecology as such is a common good, or it's supposed to be a common good. It's under whatever state regulation, national legislation on nature conservation, biodiversity conservation, as we see here in Europe and similar systems in other places. So it's not the little developer. So I think that we need, and that's one of my main points here in this that I also try to exercise inside my company, is that we actually have to have a stronger advocacy for ecology. We have actually to have, I think it's super that you could say that architects have taken it up. We have worked a lot through also have a dry cycle on blue-green infrastructure stuff that we are doing very well on. But I think still that it is always coming back to what is the business case. And if we talk about blue-green infrastructure, stormwater management and so on, then of course you can always have the business case that it's less expensive than building big concrete infrastructure for stormwater protection. But I still think that this about the ecology, who's actually the advocate for the ecology, we need to think very hard on that, because ecology as such is somehow a common good. It's not something you can take in your pocket and walk around with. So I think that that's part of the issue that we don't really have today an answer to, I think, unless any of you could.
Well, Michael, please, yeah.
Yes, well, what I was going to say is that I think there's a kind of golden opportunity at the beginning of a project to raise the level of ambition. And there are certain tools that Sarah and I talk about in our book, and I can summarize them very briefly now. One of those is about encouraging people to think over a longer term timescale and think about what it means to be a good ancestor. And if you couple that with a description of the difference between sustainable and regenerative, and I'm thinking of a sort of early brainstorming workshop at which the client and the whole team are present right at the beginning of a project. you know, if you encourage them to think about what it means to be a good ancestor, and you explain the difference between sustainable and regenerative, I think there are fairly few clients that would say that they want to be degenerative, that is their purpose in life. And you know, if they do, then you know that might be the time to conclude that it's going to be impossible to do a regenerative project with this client with these starting assumptions, and maybe to ask yourself, you know, whether you really want to lend your good name as an architect or an engineer or ecologist or whatever to their projects, because you know it may be that they don't deserve it, and maybe you've got better things to do with your time. And so I think you know, we do need to start challenging these situations and do our best to influence them early on when the opportunity exists.
I tell you what, I think that the case study that you showed in your presentation about biophilia was a really interesting one, about if you do this, there is an 8% acceleration of recovery rates. The thing that we're missing in this conversation is how the things that we do in the name of regeneration have financial cost. You know, it's a question of time horizon, isn't it? The projects that I've studied in Asia are very interesting for that very reason, that many of them are private developer led. You think that they wouldn't be interested in regenerative thinking because it's, well, you know, birds and bees, right? And tree hugging nonsense. But actually, they see this as a way of kind of creating future capital for themselves. The value of the property goes up because it's next to a park, you know. So there is a value proposition here. What's missing is the exchange rate of capitals. So we talk about financial, social, human capital, but we just don't know how to convert them. It's like having currency exchange rates. And if we had more research into that, that would be really interesting. Martha, I thought your presentation was truly exceptional, but a little scary. I mean, in that this seems to be such an endemic problem, such a deep-rooted problem in the way that we build buildings and the materials that we choose. And you talk about you know, the stage of spec writing, you know, and we need to be more aware. To be honest, I'm thinking in places like India and Vietnam, this is not relevant, because there are no mandatory disclosure requirements placed on manufacturers in these places. And even if they promise you one thing, what they're going to deliver is completely different. Yeah. So I think it'd be a good thing for practitioners to be more aware of the risk posed by material choices. But really, is that where it needs to start? Where does this conversation begin?
I would say it begins with school children. Currently, we're teaching a course called Unboxing Carbon, trying to raise the literacy of architects. And we've even had a round of teenage girls through Ramble trying to encourage STEM careers, and they also part of the course. So I think that, Neil, you hit on something that's very essential for moving forward, and that is that you say this is the common good, and this word common is extraordinarily important, because instead of appointing one group of people with a responsibility, we have to have a common responsibility, and this common responsibility starts in the way that we interact with the younger generations and the knowledge that we can convey in terms of what can choices be, and how do we approach the design and the built environment with much better information. And we need to start very young. And you're right, we can't wait to the spec phase of a project. But a lot of this is not just a decision about materials, it's a much larger decision about, should we even be building? Can we refuse to do this project because it simply makes no biological or ecological sense to do this? Can we be refusing to build new, but be encouraging perhaps a transformation project instead? Can we refuse to build the entirety of a basement? Can we reduce the program? All of these critical analysis have to happen all the way through, from the moment that the architects are called in dialogue with a client. So I feel that it's a huge dialogue that has to start from the very beginning. And if we're extraordinarily proactive, we're starting it on a societal level and really making these very difficult choices and dilemmas that we have within our industry clear to a much larger population.
Yeah, I think also that I think actually I'm relatively hopeful with all this. I have to say, maybe I'm a bit naive coming from the place I'm coming, but I'm still I'm actually hopeful because I can see that the younger generation, if you take a company like ours with 17,000 people, we have a large contingency of young people who are thinking completely different than we are, and probably are also themselves, by self-studies or through the educations they have, they are thinking much more about to do more good and to actually do things. I can just mention from the transport sector, we have a number of people who don't want to be part of projects where they build new roads. And the first time I thought, what, what is this? But they say, why should we build more roads? They are very kind of climate conscious, and they say we have the roads we have, we can improve them. And I suppose also from the buildings, I haven't heard yet about that, but it could be that people will not like to work on projects where you are using hazardous chemicals or whatever, and doing everything they can actually to take them out. And also meaning that we in the private sector as a design consulting company actually also have to say that we strive for this, we strive for a limit to embodied carbon in our projects, we strive for this and that. So I think that's something that we can do because it's good for as a company to do this, but it's also something that we are more or less led to do by our younger colleagues, I would say. So I have actually quite a big hope. I'm not very familiar with the architecture business. I have to say I'm an engineer by training myself, but I think that that architecture schools here also have a big responsibility in conveying that message, so that the people coming out of architecture schools all over the world go into practice and actually do the things that do good instead of doing more harm. And refurbishment is, of course, one of the things that may be difficult for architects because, large iconic buildings are maybe more. I know that our structural engineers like to work with complicated new structures instead of maybe looking at old stuff, but that's of course a dilemma.
That's a great segue to the question that I had on training of architects, and actually I think really we were talking about a whole new breed of experts coming at the table. I mean, if we're going to do regenerative right, do we need an ecologist at the table? I mean, do we need somebody with biological knowledge, or to your point, Neil, should we be training architects and landscape architects and engineers differently? What do you think, Michael? Is biomimicry a part of the curriculum anywhere in the world?
Well, it is, and the numbers of schools that are offering that is definitely increasing. I've noticed more of an increase in architecture schools offering regenerative design courses, which will include biomimicry, and I'm quite happy with that. That's fine. And to your point about whether we've got the right people sitting around the table, well, Janine Benyus, who's one of the best known advocates of biomimicry, she has a very good line on this. She says that the typical involvement of a biologist or an ecologist in a building project is that they're brought in to do the body count once the design is largely complete. And that's sadly quite true, less so now than it used to be. But what we really need is to bring those perspectives in very early on, where they can actually shape a much better holistic solution.
I have another quote from another expert. I know Janine well, by the way, she's lovely. Wolfgang Kessling, who's a physicist working out of Munich in Germany. He's a climate engineer, and he talks about how he needs to get to a point where he becomes irrelevant, because he's a specialist who goes into projects and advises project teams on how to deliver low energy, high comfort solutions. Yeah, but he says that if all this is going to be one project at a time done by Transolar, then that's not enough. It's got to be something that trickles into the culture of making and doing. We've got to find a way to work without the Janines and the Wolfgangs of the world. What do you think?
Were you asking me, Nimal?
Yeah, sorry, yes.
Well, I partly agree, but the thing is, you know, our understanding of the nature of the problem is moving forward the whole time. So while I like the aspiration of getting to the point where, you know, everyone understands this stuff so that we don't need experts like Wolfgang, I think we'll just find the next sort of boundaries, and where we've got to get to eventually is a really stretching target. And I think there's still scope for a lot of expertise from people who are good at taking a strategic and integrated view. And I think that's going to continue for quite a long time yet.
Last question, and this goes out to everyone. How far away are we from this? I mean, maybe just to start with you, Michael, because you were the last one off, but are words like biophilia, biomimicry becoming part of the vocabulary? Are they actually making an impact at the drawing board?
I think they are, and I think it's important that they are seen as part of a bigger shift, which involves a rethinking of our role as humans. Because, you know, one thing is for sure, our kids are not going to thank us for just being wealth creators if it's at the expense of their future. We need to think of ourselves more as co-enablers of the flourishing of all life for all time. And that's what Sarah and I put forward in the conclusion to our book.
Martha, how far are we?
We are looking at an absolute need to implement radical change immediately. And that's an enormous task. But we have to constantly remind ourselves of why we're doing it by listening to the IPCC scientists, by looking at the reports coming out of Planetary Boundaries, Stockholm Resiliency Institute, and understanding that this is not really an option. This is something we absolutely have to do. And it's not going to be especially easy for our industry.
Neil, as a practitioner, how far are we?
I think that we are well underway in understanding what we are talking about. That there is something called regenerative design. There's something about regeneration. There's this, as I started to say, the do less harm opposite to the do more good thing. I think that is something that has been, at least in our company, picked up tremendously fast, from being everybody talking about sustainability last year, everybody now talking about regeneration, of course, also fired up from the buildings people, in particularly through Dr. Hussain. And I think that, I think that the uptake of this is super. And I don't think that we need to wait until we know everything, because we will never know everything anyway. But our biggest task is actually to convince our clients. Mm. And I think this about convincing our clients is also feeding back to that we actually are able to talk about it with our clients. Because if you're not comfortable to, I don't really know what it is, then of course you will not take it up. So this about convincing our clients are the biggest task for Rampel, actually. It's also in our strategy that we need to talk to our clients about this. And you could say, back to the question, if the clients are not really in for it, then of course the question is that then a client that we would also have tomorrow? So I think it's, if we can't convince them. So convincing is super important for us. And this is also what we are training our people in, actually understanding what it is.
Brilliant. So thank you so much, everyone. That was a great conversation. I thank you all for your presentations and for what I thought was a really lively and provocative conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.